It was the summer of 1976, and the sun never truly set. We were up near Bristol Bay, working the Kvichak River run in a 50-foot gillnetter we called the Mary D, a rusty, damp coffin that smelled perpetually of diesel, salt-cured canvas, and Gus's foul pipe tobacco. Gus was my skipper, 40 years older than me, his face a map of burst capillaries and sun damage. He didn't talk much, just stared at the water, chewing on the stem of his unlit pipe. Benny, the deckhand, was 19 and all manic energy, his hands permanently cracked and bleeding, kept busy trying to ignore the gnawing dread of the endless Alaskan daylight. We'd been out for 3 weeks straight, eating canned beans and instant coffee so we could taste it like warm mud. The routine was a brutal, hypnotizing loop. Set the nets, wait, haul the nets, clean the salmon, repeat. Your shoulders never stopped aching. Your skin felt slick and rubbery from the constant exposure. The monotony was the only thing keeping the isolation from turning into outright panic. We were miles from the nearest settlement, the thick, dripping treeline on the eastern bank feeling less like a forest and more like a massive, silent, black wall watching us drift by. The only entertainment came from the local Yupik guys we'd occasionally see farther upriver. They'd wave, sometimes paddle closer, and usually drop some quiet comment about the bushmen. Gus would spit over the railing and call it native superstition, drunken tales for tourists. But the feeling was still there, a quiet static humming under the drone of the engine. It wasn't the silence of emptiness, but the silence of something waiting. Lately, though, the nets had been running light, unnaturally so. The salmon were scarce, acting skittish, bunching up in strange eddies that made no sense. Gus blamed the tides. I blamed the weather. Benny just looked nervous and kept fiddling with the radio, trying to pull in anything other than static. On Tuesday night, or what we called night, since the sun just dropped low and glowed orange against the horizon, we were working a tricky patch near a stretch of riverbank where the bank was unusually steep and dense with scrub alder. We had to use the winch to get a good anchor set. Benny was running the line when the winch groaned, then locked up violently, the engine straining. Stuck on a snag, maybe an old root. Gus grunted, disgusted. We pulled the Mary D closer to the bank, the humid air suddenly carrying a faint, musty smell, not exactly rot, but something deep, like wet earth and ozone. Gus took the boat hook and started probing the water near the anchor point. The hook hit something solid, something large that resisted the pressure like cured concrete, but without the hardness. It was submerged, right where the steep bank dropped into the muddy bottom. Damn thing's massive, Gus muttered, leaning over. He hooked the object with the heavy gaff, and we strained, pulling together. Whatever it wasn't a root or a log. It was pliable, thick, covered in slick river silt. As we hauled it a few feet closer to the surface, the object moved slightly, shifting in the current. It was dark, curved, and horrifyingly dense. Then, the water cleared just enough for the flashlight beam to hit it, revealing a massive, perfectly formed footprint, or rather, a complete cast of one, pressed into the riverbed mud, maybe 4 feet across. But the cast was attached to something else. Something long and impossibly thick was tangled in our line. Something that had the unmistakable texture of tightly woven, dark hair. We hadn't snagged a log. We had hooked the ankle of something that should not exist. We had hooked the ankle of something that should not exist. Joe didn't hesitate. He didn't scream or curse. He just grabbed his knife and slashed the line right at the spool, the braided nylon snapping back into the dark water with a wet, angry hiss. We watched the thick, dark fibers of whatever we'd caught sink out of sight, leaving behind an oily slick that smelled strangely of wet earth and ozone. The temperature dropped 5 degrees in the time it took that hair to vanish. It wasn't the natural Alaskan chill. It was a sudden, localized vacuum of warmth that made the metal railing of the skiff burn under our gloves. We were maybe half a mile from the mouth of the tributary, and the river had gone stone deaf. Usually, there was the low, constant noise of the current grinding stones, the whir of insects over the water, the distant, irritating call of a loon. Now, there was nothing. No birds flew the banks. The water itself seemed to hold its breath. That dead quiet was worse than any engine roar. It pressed in on your eardrums until you could hear the frantic pulse thumping behind your eyes. "Bear," Joe muttered, wiping a sheen of cold sweat off his brow with the back of a shaking hand. He was trying to sound certain, but his eyes kept flicking to the dark, thick spruce line, maybe 50 yards to our port side. Big brown bear, snagged on something. Just a trick of the light, the fur. Before he could finish the sentence, the sound came. It wasn't a roar or a howl. It was heavy, rhythmic percussion, a dull, deep thud that vibrated through the fiberglass hull of the boat and into the soles of my boots. It sounded like someone dropping a tree trunk, blunt and first, straight onto frozen earth. The sound came from the spruce line, deep in the shadows, and it was followed by another, closer this time, slightly louder, carrying a massive, heavy finality. Thump. Pause. Thump. Too slow for a bear. I whispered, the words catching in my dry throat. The metallic taste of fear was already coating my tongue. Too heavy. That's not forepaws running. That's two heavy objects hitting the ground, deliberately. Joe swallowed hard, his attempt at rationalization crumbling. He gripped the tiller handle, so tight his knuckles were white knots. The air was now thick with a pungent musk, like stale, wet dog mixed with the acrid decay of a swamp. It prickled the inside of my nose, forcing a gag reflex. We hadn't moved. We hadn't turned the key. We were just sitting targets in the middle of a suddenly silent river, waiting for the third thump. It didn't come. Instead, the river's surface erupted barely 30 feet away, a massive school of spawning salmon breaching simultaneously, leaping in desperate, panicked arcs before diving back down toward the deep channel. They weren't spawning, they were fleeing. And as the ripple calmed, leaving the water dark and mirror-like again, I realized the sound hadn't stopped. It had changed. It wasn't a percussive knock anymore. It was a low, guttural vibration, a resonant hum that seemed to emanate not from the trees, but from the riverbed itself, rising beneath the boat. It felt like a voice trying to remember how to speak. We hauled the skiff up immediately after that sound, dragging it over the cold, slick rocks, the wet slap of our rubber boots echoing too loudly in the sudden stillness. We didn't talk on the way back to the makeshift camp we'd established miles upriver, hidden behind a mess of deadfall spruce. The resonance of that hum had lingered, buzzing behind my eardrums like residual static. It was more disturbing than the knocks because it implied intelligence, a conscious effort at communication, or perhaps just imitation. The isolation became total. The air temperature dropped 10 degrees in the next 48 hours, settling a damp, penetrating cold into our bones that no amount of coffee or fire could alleviate. But the cold was secondary to the rising tension. We started fighting over minuscule things. The amount of fuel in the generator, who ate the last can of beans, the way someone breathed too heavily in the night. Sleep became a joke we stopped telling. We kept the generator churning, its reliable diesel rumble a pathetic attempt to drown out the world outside the small cone of light. The phenomenon escalated not in volume, but in proximity and persistence. Now, every night between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m., the footsteps came. They weren't tentative anymore. They were heavy, measured shuffles on the muddy bank, sometimes dragging, sometimes punctuated by the snap of a dry branch far too thick for any deer or bear to break casually. The steps circled our small clearing once, maybe twice, pausing just where the light failed to reach. We could feel the ground vibrating faintly through our bedrolls. Billy, always the most reliable and stoic, broke first. He stopped eating, his eyes sunken and ringed purple. He would sit hunched by the diesel drums, his rusted hunting rifle resting across his knees, refusing to take a watch. He wasn't scared. He was petrified into a kind of catatonia, muttering only about how the forest was listening and how the river was awake. We tried to force him to sleep, to take a pill, but he'd lash out with manic, desperate accusations, demanding to know why we hadn't fled yet, why we were waiting to be found. 2 nights ago, the steps stopped exactly beside the canvas wall of the tent, so close I could hear the wet, sucking sound of mud giving way beneath an unimaginable weight. Then came the smell, a terrible musk of old mildew, wet, sour blood, and a sharp, metallic tang, like ozone before a lightning strike. Then the sound that wiped away the last pretense of safety. A slow, dry scratching against the heavy canvas. It moved deliberately, rhythmically, tracing a path down the fabric, the sound vibrating directly against my skull, metal or bone digging into the coarse material. It wasn't an attack. It felt exploratory, investigated, chillingly empty of meaning. In the final, dying gasp of that whistle, Billy screamed, shoving himself backwards into the tent pole. He swore he heard his name, warped and echoing, whispered from the throat of something that shouldn't have known it. Bayuli. The sound cut off, replaced by an enormous, sickening thud against the canvas right next to Billy's head, making the entire tent shudder and dip inward under the weight. The air immediately changed. The cold river moisture was replaced by an overpowering stench of musk, rotten leaves, and something sharp and metallic, like old blood mixed with burnt oil. It was immediate, suffocating. Billy was making high-pitched, strained noises, trapped against the central pole, his eyes wide and black in the dim lantern light. I didn't move. My lungs locked up tighter than the rusted zipper. Every piece of survival instinct I possessed screamed at me to identify it. Bear, moose, drunk logger. But the sheer physical scale and the intelligent malice in that previous whistle erased all familiarity. This was wrong. This was a presence that belonged under the earth, crushing the life out of the atmosphere. Then, the zipper started moving. It wasn't being pulled gently. It was being worked with clumsy, powerful fingers. The cheap aluminum teeth shrieked against each other, grinding like gravel. I watched the line of the zipper ripple and strain as whatever was outside struggled with the mechanism, clearly unused to it, yet persistent. The sheer patience was the worst part. It wasn't panicked. It was simply solving a minor obstruction. When the zipper finally tore free, a long, ragged, ripping sound of separation, the air immediately evacuated my chest. The flap, yanked inward, revealed a column of utter blackness that devoured the meager light from the lantern. It wasn't fur I saw. It was a dense, wet, matted covering, like black river moss wrapped around something monumental. It stood well over 7 feet, hunched slightly to fit the tent opening, and it filled the entire space. The head was indistinct, sloping and heavy, but the eyes, they caught the light. 2 patches of dull, reflective amber, set deep and low, regarding us with an unnerving, complete lack of interest, the way a fisherman looks at the bait. Then the hand came in. It was colossal, broader than a dinner plate, the fingers thick, knobby, and dark. It moved slowly, without any sound of cloth or leather, just the quiet displacement of the air. It wasn't aiming for us yet. It casually swept past Billy's frozen face and grasped the handle of the metal-cased flashlight lying near the gear pile. The sound that followed was the breaking of metal, not bending, but a crisp snap. The creature squeezed the heavy-duty flashlight once, crushing the casing and shattering the lens into a dozen tiny sparks that winked out on the dirt floor. It paused, examining the damage with those terrible, indifferent eyes, before dropping the ruined object. That small, effortless act, the destruction of our most reliable piece of equipment, was the moment all my training dissolved into sludge. We weren't facing an animal competing for territory. We were an annoyance, easily dealt with. It knew my name. It had mocked us. And now, it was simply deciding which of us to remove first. I tasted pennies and bile at the back of my throat, realizing, with paralyzing certainty, that the Alaska wilderness was not empty, but simply waiting. And now, the true proprietor had arrived. I couldn't move. My feet were cemented to the muddy river bank, the smell of ancient fish guts and stale diesel mixing with something else, a wet, feral musk that burned the sinuses. The sound of the engine block being effortlessly torn off the trawler had ceased, replaced by a deep, wet breathing, right behind the curtain of the heavy pines 50 feet away. It wasn't just big, it sounded heavy, like stacked waterlogged logs shifting. Jake! The truck! Now, I managed to choke out, the sound thin and useless. Jake didn't hesitate. He was already stumbling toward the battered '76 Ford pickup, keys rattling like dice in his shaking hand. I followed, adrenaline finally kicking the paralysis out of my legs, replacing it with a painful, ragged momentum. I tasted the blood I'd bitten from the inside of my cheek. We scrambled into the cab. The plastic seat was cracked, icy cold against my back, but it felt like a bunker. I fumbled for the door lock, fingers slick with cold sweat, watching the shadows stretch and collapse among the trees. Jake shoved the key into the ignition, turning it with desperate force. Click, click, click. A dry, rattling cough from the dead battery. That was all. No, 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 no. Jake slammed his fist on the dash, a choked sob escaping him. The truck was dark, useless, smelling faintly of stale coffee and desperation. We were boxed in. The breathing stopped. Silence fell, absolute and suffocating. It was worse than the noise. That cold, vast quiet of the Alaskan night pressed down on us, reminding us how far we were from anything human. Then came the sound of wet leather dragging across the dirt, a noise too deliberate, too slow. It was rounding the truck from the passenger side, Jake's side. "Don't look at it, Mike," Jake whispered, his voice thin as glass, staring straight ahead through the grubby windshield. "Just don't look at it." I didn't need to look. I saw the shadow first, a bulk that swallowed the dim moonlight, blotting out the stars above the hood of the truck. It reached the passenger window. I heard the thick, damp sound of a knuckle rapping softly, almost courteously, against the glass, right beside Jake's ear. Jake screamed. It wasn't a brave scream, or even a panicked one. It was the sound of a lung collapsing instantly. In a move fueled by pure, blinding instinct, I kicked open my door, plunging out into the frozen mud and throwing myself toward the thicket on the far side of the path. I heard the sickening, explosive sound of the passenger window imploding behind me, followed by a wet, tearing sound and a guttural, satisfied snort. There was no time to register Jake's fate, no time to grieve the awful, abrupt silence that followed. He had bought me 3 seconds, maybe 4. I hit the ground hard, rolling down a short, scrubby embankment toward the dark, fast-running river. The cold water instantly soaked my jeans, the shock stealing my breath, but I kept crawling, pushing through frozen willow branches that scraped my face. I could hear it stepping out of the truck, the ground vibrating under its heavy, measured pace. It wasn't running. It was stalking. I managed to pull myself upright just as I reached the lip of the bank. I looked back, briefly. In the faint reflected light off the river, I saw it standing by the overturned truck. It was watching me. Its head was tilted slightly, studying my pathetic scramble, like a farmer studying a particularly tenacious rat. I dove blindly into the freezing current, the water instantly closing over my head, tasting like iron and ancient silt. I had to get away from the smell, away from the sound, and pray the terrible, killing cold of the river would confuse it long enough for me to disappear. The river's killing cold failed to stop me. I fought through the tearing agony in my chest and the black delirium, scrambling onto the muddy bank 20 yards downstream. I didn't feel the sharp rocks tearing my hands. I only registered the immediate, visceral need to be away from the towering shadow and the overwhelming stench of rotten meat and wet fur. I dragged a useless left leg for what felt like eternity, moving until the sight of the wrecked truck was gone and the sound of the deep forest was the only witness. I walked for 4 hours, hypothermic, spitting up bile and silt, fueled by a single, pulsing fear that refused to let my heart stop. A logging crew found me at dawn, 10 miles from where the Selkie sank. They thought I was just another drunk idiot who'd capsized his dinghy. In the end, only 3 of us were brought back from the river: me, Jensen, and Billy. Jensen lasted less than 2 weeks. He never stopped seeing the shadows dance in the corners of his vision, even under the harsh fluorescence of the city lights. They found him hanging in his shed, a frantic, crude note carved into the wooden wall that only read, "It knows the names." Billy? Billy is gone. He's housed in a state facility, rocking gently, forever humming the unnaturally high-pitched, mocking whistle we heard just before the attack. The authorities were quick to close the file. They found the overturned truck and some torn canvas, but nothing conclusive. No footprint that wasn't smudged by the current, no hair sample they couldn't attribute to local fauna, and no body parts. Just the metallic, foul scent, which the coroner dismissed as natural decay amplified by my panic. They called it a tragic combination of poor judgment, rough water, and possible alcohol abuse, despite our meticulously kept sobriety logs. They looked at my raw, terrified face and saw a man fabricating a desperate horror story to shield himself from the guilt of his friends' deaths. They didn't believe a word. They never do. I moved south, far from the deep woods inlets, to the rough, honest coastline where the ocean at least lets you see the danger coming. But the experience left a seam, a quiet, constant pressure behind my eyeballs. The scar is not the stitch work on my thigh where the frostbite set in. It's the knowledge that every shuffer, they think they cleaned up the mess. They think the woods are empty and benign. But I know it is still there, moving with silent patience between the spruce and the frozen water. It didn't chase me out of necessity. It chased me to assert dominion, to ensure I understood the hierarchy. It tasted human